Okay, so first of all, I'm really sorry it took so long to make the next part of this timeline, but after slaving myself 4 hours at a time, I finally am ready to break down to you the entire timeline of every single adjustment and amazing player that shaped the wide receiver position into what it is today. So we got a lot to go over, so let's just get right into it, starting all the way back in the 1940s. Yeah, we're going all the way back. Now, imagine the year is 1940. There's only 10 teams in the entire league and one playoff game a year, that game being effectively the Super Bowl. And in this particular year, the NFL championship game wasn't close, but regardless, there was still a lot to look forward to in the future of the league. Because in the year 1933, 7 years prior, the NFL made a huge rule change that officially made it completely legal for any thrower of the football to throw a forward pass from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage, as compared to the previous rule where you basically had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. So this rule would allow quarterbacks much more flexibility to throw to their receivers, and almost immediately after this rule came into effect, we were introduced to possibly the most dominant athlete to ever play a single sport. Well, with that introduction, I'd like to introduce you to the most important wide receiver in NFL history, the Wilt Chamberlain of football, Don Hutson. This man alone is the godfather, the avatar of the wide receiver position. So back when Don Hutson came into the league, there was no NFL draft, so Don got offered a deal he couldn't turn down from the Packers, which was a salary of $175 a game. And apparently the Packers only got Hutson on their team because their envelope with his contract in it delivered faster to the NFL president's front desk than their opponent's envelopes did. Now, once Don Hutson became a Packer, it took him a few seasons to start cooking, but once he got going, it was clear that he was going to be taking no prisoners and leaving carnage everywhere on his journey to basically creating the wide receiver position. From 1938 all the way to his last season in 1945, Don Hutson made first-team All-Pro every year while just being an overall statistical anomaly. Just listen to these statistics. Don Hutson led the NFL in receiving 7 out of 9 seasons and was so dominant during that stretch that statistically speaking, Don Hutson caught 1 touchdown every 5 passes he caught. Do you know how impossible that is? And during Hudson's reign of terror, he was a huge factor on 3 Packers championship teams. No, seriously, because Don Hutson also played safety, accumulating 30 picks in his career, as well as kicker for the Packers, even leading the league in field goals once. So he was actually just some ancient football deity. But back on track with the wide receiver thing, Don Hutson at 6'1", 180 was night and day, just better than everyone in his era, and gave everyone a small glimpse of what the wide receiver position could possibly be capable of. Now, what is also very important about Don Hutson is the modern offensive schemes that we've come to know today just didn't exist back then. Legendary Packers figure, and at the time Packers coach Curly Lambeau, often had Don Hutson line up next to the O-line similar to a modern tight end, rather than splitting him out wide. So, just something to monitor looking at the film of these players going forward, but I really wanted to talk about other receivers from this era, like Ken Kavanaugh or Jim Benton, but they really just don't compare at all. Like I said before, the passing game at this point was severely underdeveloped, and just by looking at these highlights, you can tell offensive schemes as a whole are still light years away from the modern game. But with that being said, we move on from the 1940s to the 1950s, where instead of one guy just overshadowing everyone else, we got to see some diverse talent really spread their wings. So to define the 1950s, like I said, several different players would go on to create a mold that would later become crucial in the wide receiver's evolution. The first guy I want to bring to the chopping block is Elroy Hirsch, arguably the most important wide receiver from this decade. Anyways, back in those days, it was common, if not encouraged, for NFL players to also have served time in the armed forces, and Elroy Hirsch was no exception, as before the NFL he enlisted in the Marine Corps and even played football there. This has nothing to do with the evolution of the position, but I thought it was cool. So after being drafted by the Rams in 1945, Elroy never even suited up for them until 4 years later in 1949. And after 2 years of getting used to his new coaching staff, which consisted of, most importantly, receivers coach Red Hickey, who was a revolutionary coach for his time, even being credited with creating the shotgun position. So that should should show how much the Rams valued getting the ball to their receivers. Now, in just about the most pristine environment a wide receiver could have possibly been in during this time, Elroy flourished, making 3 Pro Bowls and 2 first-team All-Pros in a 3-year span, and even had another Hall of Fame receiver, Tom Fears, playing alongside him. And in that time, he was given the nickname Crazy Legs, which, in terms of nicknames, I've definitely heard better, but still, I do think that Hirsch's unorthodox running style exemplifies the fact that running styles weren't even a thing yet, and techniques as a whole were still completely raw. Not even one coach thought about trying to make his strides as efficient as possible, which is absolutely imperative in the modern NFL today. But Elroy wasn't just some guy who was pretty solid in the 1950s and ran like a lobotomized ostrich. He is actually one of the first guys to become a real deep threat specialist and constructed the first blueprint to a staple component in the wide receiver arsenal. So while Elroy was stirring the wide receiver pot and adding his own ingredients, another wide receiver, Raymond Berry, would come in and wouldn't add any real physical gifts, but his intangible accomplishments would become a staple in the wide receiver position going forward. Raymond Berry played the entirety of his career for the Baltimore Colts, and during his time there, along with Hall of Fame quarterback Johnny Unitas and a scheme that heavily relied on a punishing O-line, Berry and Unitas showed what a quarterback and receiver can become if they're able to build a mental connection with one another, and how deadly that can be. Now, the problem with the QB wideout connection thing is that there's no set-in-stone way to statistically prove anything, but I think the best example of showing the true power a quarterback-wide receiver connection can have would be the greatest game ever, the 1958 NFL Championship game. And in that game, Johnny Unitas would throw pass after pass to Raymond Berry throughout the game, knowing in advance where he would be at the top of his route. And Berry finished that championship game with a monstrous 12 grabs for 178 yards and a touchdown. So other teams around the league saw that the Colts were winning championships with Johnny Unitas and Raymond Berry being the focal point of the offense, and naturally tried to replicate that. And did it work? Well, not for most teams, to be perfectly honest with you, but one guy alone separated himself from every other wide receiver in the 1960s, and maybe evolved the position more than anyone ever, and to this day still gets almost no credit for it. So moving on into the 1960s, near the end of the decade, the AFL-NFL merger occurred, which really enhanced the overall talent pool, but before the merger, the AFL was enjoying a renaissance in passing compared to the NFL, and the wide receiver that spearheaded this mold-breaking style of receiving was Chargers wideout Lance Allworth. But hold on, because I wasn't being dramatic when I said the 1960s were the most important time in the wide receiver's evolution history. But before we get into that, let's talk about the man behind the man, the mastermind behind the biggest leap in evolution in the wide receiver's history, Chargers coach Sid Gillman. So the chances you've heard of Sid Gillman are low, but just to give you a little topic sentence of what he was about, Sid Gillman is basically the godfather of the forward pass. And he would bring his talents and ideas to the Chargers in their first year of existence in 1960, where he took the head coaching job, and then picked up Lance Allworth in the 1962 draft 2 years later. And once those two were paired together, they unleashed the full potential of a pass-heavy offense. Almost immediately after acquiring Allworth, Sid Gillman tailored the entire offense to revolve around Lance, which resulted in one of the best wide receiver careers of all time, as some of his statistical accomplishments include 7 straight 1,000-yard seasons and 6 straight All-Pro selections, catching 542 passes in his career for an average of 19 yards per catch, and just for good measure, he also caught 85 touchdowns. Lance Allworth also did all of this while playing the flanker position rather than an official wide receiver, which basically just means he was spread out wide but still off the ball. That's kind of the only difference. Anyway, with the most pass-heavy coach in the entire league, Lance Allworth was able to light the league on fire, stealing from the Elroy Hirsch build of receiver by basically running deep every single play, fully adapting the flawless air-it-out system, its scientific name also known as the he's down there somewhere offense. Now, for other receivers during this decade, you got guys like Don Maynard, Paul Warfield, and Bobby Mitchell, who are very interesting players in terms of their career arcs, but they didn't contribute to the evolution of the position enough in my eyes. But Don Maynard was on that 1958 Giants team that played in the greatest game ever, so that's cool. But we move on into the 1970s, and because of the merger as well as other factors, mainly wide receivers just getting abused off the line of scrimmage, this forced receivers to invent new ways to evolve the position. So instead of creating more mutant versions of a pass receiver build, the 1970s seemed to focus more on refinement, and the best examples of this was a concept that was briefly experimented with Elroy Hirsch and Tom Fears in the 50s, the idea of pairing two unstoppable receivers on either side of the quarterback. And this new concept was fully ignited by two teams in particular, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Oakland Raiders, and they just so happened to be the two most successful teams of the decade. So the Pittsburgh Steelers first drafted wide receivers Lynn Swann and John Stallworth, and two other Hall of Famers in the same 1974 draft. Easily the second best draft class of all time, right behind the 2020 Raiders. Now, because the Steelers of the 1970s already had a core in place with Terry Bradshaw and others, this resulted in a relatively smooth transition from the college level to the pros for both receivers Swann and Stallworth. Also, for what it's worth, the Steelers at this time were being coached by the legendary Chuck Noll, who was a direct offspring from the Sid Gillman coaching tree, so there was going to be enough passes to go around. And as expected, the Steelers had the most lethal offense for the entire decade, led by their dynamic duo of two very different receivers. Lynn Swann was always more of a finesse guy who would make acrobatic grabs and grab the attention of the crowd, whereas John Stallworth was a very fundamental receiver who very rarely made mistakes. But during their time playing together, the two receivers weren't always overly friendly with one another, mainly due to their desires to be better than the other. And that is what makes a true wide receiver duo, the willingness to push the other to be as close to perfect as humanly possible, as together Stallworth and Swann both had the exact same statistics in Pro Bowls with 3, All-Pro selections with 1, and each had 4 Super Bowl championships. But there was one team that challenged the Steelers' throne in the 70s, and that was the Oakland Raiders, armed with a dynamic duo of wide receivers for their own. They had the most attractive receiver in NFL history, Fred Biletnikoff, and he was drafted in 1965 by the Raiders, and it wasn't until 7 years later when they would get their duo in the 1972 draft when they picked up Cliff Branch. And in those 7 years by himself before Cliff arrived, Fred Biletnikoff asserted himself as one of the best pure hands players in the league. He wasn't very fast at all, but he was a real hard worker and a great scrappy player. But flash forward to 1972, where Cliff Branch enters the scene as the complete antithesis of Biletnikoff. Branch was a speedster specialist, and was really the first guy to take the Elroy Hirsch deep threat variation of the position and level it up to a whole nother stratosphere by injecting inhuman speed into it. So while Biletnikoff was controlling the mid to low level of the field, Cliff Branch was there to blow the top off the defense as he seemingly ran an 80-yard bomb on every play. And once again, the guy who put this entire team together, Raiders owner Al Davis, had a vision of an air-it-all-out offense, and guess what? He came from the coaching tree of Sid Gillman. Anyway, I'd like to talk about one more player from this era. One guy that is an underrated, crucial cornerstone in the wide receiver's evolution, the football aberration that is Harold Carmichael. Let me start this analysis off by saying that Harold Carmichael is probably the most interesting wide receiver to ever live. You know what? Actually, on second thought, cut that out. And after being drafted to the Eagles in 1971, Carmichael was forced to play tight end because he came into the league at 6'8", 225, still to this day the tallest wide receiver to ever play. But it didn't take long for the Eagles to realize the horrible mistake they made and moved Carmichael back to his natural position of wide receiver. And once he got comfortable, the 6'8" monster of destruction carved out a Hall of Fame career, making 4 Pro Bowls as well as the Hall of Fame 1970s team. Also, more importantly, Harold Carmichael on those 70s Eagles teams is basically unofficially credited with popularizing the wide receiver quick screen, a play that is pretty much a staple of every offense in the league today, something you really wouldn't expect from, you know, the tallest wide receiver in NFL history. So, although Harold pioneering the quick screen is cool and all, what he most importantly brought to the evolution of the position was his size and the confirmed success a super athlete can have at the wide receiver position. He might not be super important for a few decades, but I promise later on he will be an essential model that multiple modern receivers have copied to a T. So with that being said, we move on to the 1980s. But before I say anything about the players from this decade, I couldn't make this video without talking about the most most important rule change that changed the way the wide receiver position was played forever. In the year 1978, right before the turn of the decade, the Mel Blount rule was officially put into play, stopping all contact on receivers 5 yards past the line of scrimmage. Now, yeah, evolution is cool, Charles Darwin and all that, but if this rule hadn't been passed, the wide receiver's evolution would have definitely been capped out at some point. Because now with this rule in play, receivers were able to run their routes much more freely for the first time ever, giving the receiver the edge over the defensive backs. So, with that being said, this is Jerry Rice. He played the wide receiver position in the National Football League and got the football a few times, racking up an arguably above average resume along the way. To sum his career up, Jerry Rice was the perfect storm at the perfect time in the history of the game. I'm honestly not even sure how much Jerry Rice evolved the game forward, because nobody before or since then has ever been able to replicate what he's done. Not one human being on the field could cover the man at all. Nobody outworked him off the field, and he owns almost every major statistical record a wide receiver could own, as he still to this day is the all-time leader in career receptions with 1,549, receiving yards by a mile with 22,895, and career receiving touchdowns by so much it makes me mad. There has never and likely will ever be another Jerry Rice. But the most impressive thing about Rice's career is, up to that point, Jerry was the ultimate product of evolution of the wide receiver. He was drafted to the 49ers by head coach Bill Walsh, another pure descendant of the Sid Gilman coaching tree. And that goes even deeper too, as Walsh helped bring in fellow Pro Bowl receiver John Taylor to form almost undisputably the most productive receiving duo in NFL history, taking from another previous mold. One guy was a little more productive than the other, but that's not the point. Also, Rice was somehow able to harness the dark magic once wielded by Raymond Berry and Johnny Unitas to form his own unbreakable connection with Joe Montana and later Steve Young. And most importantly, Jerry Rice was the first to completely abuse the Mel Blount rule being in place, doing everything he could to find holes in opposing defenses, in the process showing the true potential of yards after the catch. Look, I could go on and on forever about Jerry Rice. I mean, the dude was a dominant receiver from the age of 23 to the crisp age of 40, and just like Don Hudson, Jerry Rice basically power creeps every other receiver from the 1980s. Don't get me wrong, the 1980s were full of incredible receivers like Steve Largent, Art Monk, James Lofton, and even another great wideout duo of Mark Duper and Mark Clayton, but all of those guys just didn't do anything better than Jerry Rice did, so their place in the wide receiver's evolution is always just going to be overshadowed. So with that out of the way, we move on into the 1990s, where instead of evolving the position in terms of technique and strategies, the wide receiver was experimented with and later confirmed to be a viable option as the primary threat on Super Bowl winning offenses. Obviously, receivers like the aforementioned Jerry Rice, as well as guys like Andre Reed, expert barber Michael Irving, and loving husband Rod Smith appeared in 9 out of the 10 possible Super Bowls in the decade of the 90s, which really helped to propel the wide receiver into the spotlight of the league. And to touch more on those guys, not to beat a dead horse even more, but there were guys like Michael Irvin and Andre Reed who continued to push the OG Unitas to Barry connection to its limits with their own Hall of Fame quarterbacks, as well as eternally underrated guys like Herman Moore and Sterling Sharp, who were fundamental senseis similar to guys like John Stallworth before them. But one wide receiver who only played 2 seasons in the 90s evolved the position more than anyone else did in 10 years besides Jerry Rice, and that guy is the football demon, every cornerback's boogie monster, Randy Moss. So Randy Moss was drafted in 1998 by the Vikings, fortunately being drafted to a very good team that already had a great wide receiver in Chris Carter, and even more importantly employed head coach Dennis Green, yet another guy who has immediate connections to Sid Gilman's coaching tree. So apparently, if you're coming from Gilman's tree and you have a star wide receiver, it's just a free ticket to being a cornerstone of the wide receiver's evolution, because Randy Moss came into the league, and the second he stepped foot on a gridiron, he completely scorched the entire league like never seen before. In his rookie year, the dude caught a still standing record 17 touchdowns, racked up 1,313 yards, and made a Pro Bowl team and first team All-Pro as a rookie. So shockingly, the guy who was nicknamed the Freak took from the wide receiver mold built by Harold Carmichael and combined it with previous big play receivers like Lance Allworth to form a brand new unguardable homunculus simplest version of the wide receiver, that being the freakishly athletic, fundamentally sound wide receiver. Now, we enter the 2000s decade of football, and what I believe to be, to this day, the highest collection of talent the position has seen in one decade. I mean, just look at these guys. You got deep threats building off the Lance Allworth, Elroy Hirsch build of receivers like Torrey Holt and the aforementioned Randy Moss, who continued his reign of superiority, of course. Then you got receivers who took from the Jerry Rice mold and focused on simply not making mistakes, as well as being relatively quiet, oddly enough, all while mastering the fundamentals like Larry Fitzgerald, Andre Johnson, and Marvin Harrison. Then you have my personal favorite evolution of receivers to date, what I like to call the psychopath build. These one-of-a-kind players include registered maniac Hines Ward, the OG diva wideout Terrell Owens, and the guy who somehow continues to stay relevant, Chad Ochocinco. I mean, the guy literally legally changed his name to his number. But evolution-wise, the wide receiver was sort of expanded for the first time. It was now very common for every single receiver on the field to be just as capable of catching and running a slant route as they would be running a go route. But although versatility was reaching its apex, as you'll see, there was still room to improve. So with that flawless segue, we move into the last completed decade of football, the 2010s, where in terms of evolution, the position continues to rely on raw talent, freaks of nature, and coaching schemes rather than any intricate changes to the wideout. But let me give you a list of the best wide receivers of the 2010s, and let's see if you can notice a pattern. Julio Jones, Antonio Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, Calvin Johnson, Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas, Larry Fitzgerald, and Dez Bryant. Now, with the exception of Antonio Brown's chip with the Bucks later in his, I guess, villain arc, every single one of these great receivers failed to win a championship, and only a few of them actually even got close. But in terms of evolution, I think the biggest point here is the complete refinement and absolute staple that is having a quarterback and wide receiver connection. Now, to speak back on the evolution of the position, every single one of those guys that I previously listed formed an unbreakable bond with a quarterback they spent multiple years with, and instead of in the 1960s where the Barry to Unitas connection was idolized, it is now a staple of the modern game to have an always dependable wide receiver QB connection. But as always, there was one guy from this decade that just completely separated himself from the rest of his competition, and this time that guy was Calvin Johnson. So Calvin Johnson seriously had the potential to become the greatest wide receiver of all time, and there are people out there that will die on the hill that he is the greatest of all time, or at least the most talented wide receiver we've ever seen. Remember how I said Harold Carmichael would be important later on? Well, here we are. Calvin Johnson was only 3 inches shorter than the tallest receiver in NFL history in Harold Carmichael, which already made him unguardable, but he was also much more muscular than Carmichael, had 10 pounds on him, ran much faster than him, and he even had the skill and finesse of an elite slot receiver. In almost every way, shape, and form, Calvin Johnson was a perfect Greek god of a receiver, and to this day is still the pinnacle of the wide receiver's evolution. His only flaw, the one thing that held him down throughout his entire career, was the Detroit Lions, and they seem to be kind of a theme throughout these timeline videos. Alright, now as the 2020s unfold, it seems as if the key ingredient for the wide receiver's evolution is going to be versatility. We've already seen the potential an offense can have if you take your best wideout and move him all over the field in guys like Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp. But to come full circle, you still have young guys like Jamar Chase that have enhanced the old school Elroy Hirsch, Cliff Branch mold of wide receiver, or Justin Jefferson's fundamental route running of, dare I say, building off of Jerry Rice and Randy Moss. And the rabbit hole can just keep going deeper, because you can look at a guy like DK Metcalf who seemingly injected pure testosterone into the Harold Carmichael build, and even an older guy like Cooper Kupp heavily taking the Marvin Harrison build and adding his own little sprinkle of modern versatility to it. Whoever the player may be, the wide receiver position has gone through countless evolutions throughout time, and I am sure that in the future, the position that we've all come to know and love today is still not done evolving to this very moment. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then like and comment, because this video really took a long time to edit. This was definitely the hardest video I've ever had to make, so if you could feed my ego a little bit, that'd be greatly appreciated. But if you like this video, then watch this video right here on the screen with the complete evolution of the running back timeline. I think if you like this video, then you'll like that one too. Anyways, until next time.